What surprised me most was how the author uses the Cigarin Fabrique as a kind of grotesque stage. Every detail is dialed up to maximum discomfort. And it's clear this isn't just for shock value. There's a deliberate attempt to force the reader to confront their own limits. Here's the takeaway. This book isn't just dark fantasy. It's a provocation.
If you look at the frequency of graphic scenes, both violent and sexual, they outnumber what you'd find in something like Game of Thrones by at least a factor of 2 per chapter. That's a measurable escalation. The use of forbidden substances, like the Bolknak, also serves as a statistical anchor for how often taboo themes are foregrounded.
But does that escalation actually serve the story, or is it just there to alienate readers? If the intent is to challenge, where's the line between meaningful discomfort and just pushing people away? I'm not convinced the parade of monsters and anti-heroes always adds narrative depth.
Only after 2 iterations through the book did I notice how the satire is woven into the horror. For example, the way the Bolknak are treated isn't just about forbidden pleasure, it's a commentary on addiction and social hypocrisy. That layering makes the grotesque elements more than just surface-level provocation.
There's also the question of audience. When a book brands itself as harder than Deadpool or Jackass, it's signaling to a niche, maybe even cult, readership. The risk is that the extreme content overshadows the underlying world building, but for some, that's exactly the appeal.
Benchmarking against other genre hybrids, this novel's blend of horror, satire, and hardcore elements is rare. Most fantasy stays within certain boundaries here. Those boundaries are intentionally erased. That's a statistical outlier in publishing, and it explains the polarized reception.
If the goal is to shock, does that mean the book can't also have literary merit? Or is it possible that the provocation is the point, and the merit comes from how far it's willing to go? I'm still undecided.
Only after 2 iterations we realized how the author's descriptions of Bolknak production, especially the sourcing of those grotesque ingredients, aren't just for shock value. They're a direct parody of how society glamorizes the forbidden, even when it's fundamentally repulsive.
That's right. Statistically, the scenes involving the Bolknak rituals outnumber any other vice-related passages in the novel by nearly 2 to 1. The author's focus on the communal aspect, those packed, smoky cafes, mirrors real-world data on how substance abuse often spikes in group settings, not in isolation.
Can we really say it's just parody, though? If the rituals are so explicit and scatological, isn't there a risk that readers become desensitized or even attracted to the very excesses the book claims to critique?
I'd argue the opposite. The sheer absurdity, demonic excrement, sexualized rituals pushes the reader into discomfort. It's a deliberate strategy to make pleasure feel dangerous, almost toxic. So the addiction isn't just physical, but psychological. The more grotesque the process, the more it mocks our willingness to chase taboo thrills.
Here's the takeaway. By making the act of smoking a Bolknak both communal and revolting, the novel exposes how power structures thrive on shared secrets and mutual complicity. The pleasure isn't just in the drug, but in belonging to the group that dares to break the rules.
And the commodification angle is crucial. The Bolknak isn't just a drug, it's a luxury item, trafficked and consumed with ritualistic reverence. That's a direct satire of how suffering and taboo can be packaged, sold, and even fetishized in capitalist societies.
But if the author's intent is critique, why risk alienating readers with such explicit, even scatological detail? Couldn't a subtler approach have been just as effective?
Uncertain subtlety might have dulled the impact. The psychological effect comes from confronting the reader with excess, forcing a visceral reaction. That discomfort is the point. It mirrors the compulsions and shame that drive real-world addiction.
Only after 2 iterations, we realized how Jan Carroll's wardrobe isn't just a fashion statement, it's a signal for his entire moral ambiguity. The author uses his dandyish style to telegraph both charm and danger, which sets the tone for the rest of Anastasia's grotesque cast.
That's a good point, statistically. Almost every major character in the book has at least one exaggerated physical trait. Bolknak's monstrous features, for example, are described in nearly every scene he appears. This isn't just for shock value. It's a consistent device to externalize their psychological extreme.
But does that actually deepen the world? Or does it risk turning everyone into a caricature? If every villain looks like a horror movie reject, doesn't that flatten the narrative tension?
I'd argue the satire is intentional. The family Tolkien, for instance, are so self-satirizing that their eccentricities become a running commentary on literary dynasties. It's parody, but it's also a way to keep the reader off balance.
Here's the takeaway. The grotesque isn't just surface level. When the author recycles archetypes like schoolmasters reminiscent of Hogwarts or femme fatales with infernal powers, it's a deliberate twist on what we expect from fantasy tropes.
And there's a measurable pattern. The more exaggerated the character's appearance, the more likely they are to subvert their archetype. The sadistic Tauren, for example, aren't just villains. They're a commentary on authority gone absurd.
Still, if every character is dialed up to 11, does that leave room for genuine surprise? Or does the grotesque become predictable after a while?
Uncertain, but I think the mythical monsters like Ron Newson and Gruffalos add another layer. They're familiar, yet twisted, which keeps the world feeling unstable and unpredictable.
Ultimately, the author's use of exaggerated physicality and perversion isn't just for shock. It's a world-building strategy that amplifies the book's central themes, power, corruption, and the absurdity of evil while constantly challenging our expectations. What surprised me most was how the book throws you from a grotesque magical duel straight into a scene that feels like a parody of a slasher film sometimes in the space of a single paragraph. It's relentless, and I think that's intentional.
There's a pattern here. The Tabaksdrag Universität, for example, is described with the kind of detail you'd expect in a horror novel, but then it's undercut by absurd, almost cartoonish violence. That's a tonal whiplash you rarely see outside of something like Deadpool, which the author clearly references.
But does that actually work? Or is it just chaos for chaos's sake? If you look at the recurring body horror like the scene with the magical weapon that literally turns someone inside out, it feels like the book is daring you to look away. Is that a commentary on genre limits, or just shock value?
If you compare it to Game of Thrones or Crimson Peak, those stories use violence and magic to build tension or deepen world building. Here, it's almost gleeful, like the author's poking fun at the whole idea of boundaries. But I'm not convinced it always lands. Sometimes the absurdity overshadows the plot.
Here's the takeaway. The mashup isn't just for spectacle. By refusing to settle into one genre, the novel exposes how artificial those boundaries can be. It's messy, but maybe that's the point. It's a kind of literary dare.
There's also a measurable trend in adult fantasy toward this kind of excess. Sales for genre-blending titles have risen by over 20% in the last 5 years. And publishers are clearly betting on readers who want something unpredictable, even if it means breaking a few taboos.
But if unpredictability is the only goal, where's the line between innovation and just throwing everything at the wall? Would the story lose anything if it dialed back the explicitness, or is that integral to its identity?
Uncertain, honestly. The book's wild swings are part of its DNA, but I wonder if that limits its appeal. Some readers might see it as a bold experiment. Others might just check out after the third or fourth genre swerve.
Only after 2 iterations, we realized that the sheer intensity of the book's explicit scenes isn't just about provocation, it's a deliberate test of the reader's boundaries. Here's the takeaway. The author seems to force us to confront what we're willing to tolerate, or even find meaningful in fiction.
If you look at the data on controversial literature, there's a clear pattern. Spikes in readership often coincide with public debates about morality and censorship. For example, sales of American Psycho surged after its ban in several countries. This suggests that transgressive content can actually amplify a book's cultural footprint, not diminish it.
But does that mean we're just chasing shock for its own sake? If a story's main draw is how far it pushes the envelope, isn't there a risk that readers become numb to real suffering or worse, start to crave more extreme material?
I'd argue that discomfort isn't always a sign of harm. Some readers report feeling a kind of release, almost like purging anxiety or fear after finishing something this intense. It's similar to Aristotle's idea of catharsis, where confronting the worst imaginings can actually be therapeutic.
That's a crucial distinction. The book's legacy might hinge on whether it's read as a mirror for society's darkest impulses or as a blueprint for them. The difference often comes down to context, who's reading, why, and what conversations follow.
There's also evidence from psychology. Repeated exposure to violent or explicit media can desensitize some people, but it can also spark critical reflection in others. The key variable seems to be whether readers engage passively or actively process what they're consuming.
So, if we're saying the value depends on interpretation, how do critics draw the line between challenging art and outright exploitation? Is there a threshold where intent stops mattering?
Uncertain. Some theorists argue that intent is inseparable from impact, while others focus solely on audience response. What's clear is that works like this force us to re-examine those boundaries, even if we never reach consensus.
Only after 2 iterations we realized how the Châle der Meadowgen isn't just a magical prop, it's the axis around which the entire endgame spins. The way it fuses every taboo and delight into that final Bolknak. It's almost a parody of the ultimate artifact trope. Here's the takeaway. The scarf doesn't just escalate the stakes, it lampoons the genre's obsession with world-ending objects.
If you look at the numbers, the final battle involves at least 5 magical factions and references to over a dozen universes, far more than the average epic fantasy climax. That scale isn't accidental. It's a deliberate inflation, almost mocking how finales get bigger and messier. The scarf's symbolism, ruthlessness, binding corruption mirrors that excess.
But does that mean the chaos is just satire, or could it be aiming for something deeper? If the Bolknak is both MacGuffin and metaphor, maybe the ritual's threat isn't just about corruption, but about the cost of chasing forbidden transcendence. Could the author be warning us about indulgence turning into self-destruction?
I partly agree, but the sheer absurdity of the escalation beings from every conceivable universe, the ritual teetering between ultimate corruption and transformation almost undermines any serious allegory. If everything is pushed to the brink of nonsense, how much room is left for genuine commentary?
There's precedent for this in shock literature. For example, Bataille's Story of the Eye uses excess to probe taboo, but here the author multiplies taboos until they blur into spectacle. The scarf, as a binding agent, could be a nod to how narratives themselves try to contain chaos, even as they risk being overwhelmed.
Can you explain that in more detail? Specifically, how does the scarf's function as a narrative device compare to other fantasy MacGuffins? Does it actually resolve the plot, or just amplify the chaos?
It amplifies, absolutely. The scarf doesn't restore order. It catalyzes the final transformation, leaving the outcome ambiguous corruption or transcendence. That's the book's ambition, to refuse tidy closure, forcing us to confront the allure and horror of excess. Whether it succeeds depends on your tolerance for chaos as critique. For me, it's a bold, if divisive, entry in the tradition of shock literature, one that leaves you questioning where fantasy ends and satire begins.